The wind was a thief, stealing the warmth from Alara's bones and the hope from her heart. It scoured the high plains with a relentless malice, carrying grit that stung her cheeks and whispered accusations she had heard too many times before. Here, on the barren acreage that was both her inheritance and her prison, the sky was an unforgiving expanse of pale, indifferent blue. The cabin, built by her late husband's hands, sagged as if weary of the struggle. Its timbers groaned a constant lament, a sound that echoed the ache in her own soul. It had been a year since the lightning strike, a single violent slash of fire from a summer storm that had left her a widow and, in the eyes of the townsfolk in redemption, a curse. They called her the Blackbird Widow, a name spoken in hushed tones at the mercantile, a chilling brand that ensured her isolation. Her grief was a private country, and its borders were patrolled by their judgment. Today, the loneliness was a physical weight. The last of the flour was a dusty film at the bottom of the sack, the jerky was gone, and the small vegetable patch had surrendered to the punishing sun weeks ago. Despair was a cold, smooth stone in her belly. She stood on the porch, one hand gripping a splintered post, and watched the horizon. A new shape had appeared there a month prior. A man. He'd taken the adjacent plot, a stretch of land even more forsaken than her own. She never saw him go to town. She only saw his silhouette at dawn and dusk, a stark figure moving with a quiet, unnerving purpose. He was building something, a small sod house, with a patience that seemed to defy the hostile landscape. He was an unknown quantity, another threat in a world full of them. Her fear, a constant companion, sharpened at the sight of him. He was a man alone, and men alone out here were either running from something or looking for something to take. She wrapped her thin shawl tighter, a futile gesture against the chill that had nothing to do with the air. The world had shrunk to this patch of dust, this failing cabin, and the terrible, gnawing silence. A shadow fell across the plains, swift and consuming, as a wall of bruised clouds rolled in from the west. A storm was coming. Not a cleansing summer rain, but a wrathful autumn gale, the kind that tore at the land and exposed every weakness. The first drop of rain, cold and heavy, struck her forehead like a judgment. She flinched, her gaze darting from the angry sky to the distant, solitary figure of the man. He had stopped his work and was looking toward her property, his posture unervingly still. He was too far to see his face, but she felt his gaze as surely as she felt the wind whipping her hair across her face. He was watching, always watching. A tremor of a new, more immediate fear ran through her. The townsfolk had abandoned her to the elements, content to let God or the devil finish what they believed she had started. But this man, this stranger, he was a different kind of unknown. The wind howled, carrying the scent of rain and wet sage, and Alara retreated into the gloom of her cabin, bolting the door against the storm, and the man, and the world that had cast her out. The first leaks began to drip from the ceiling, each one a ticking clock counting down her resolve. The storm broke with the fury of a biblical plague. Rain came not in drops but in solid, wind-driven sheets that hammered the roof and walls. The cabin shuddered, its groans deepening into screams of protest. Inside, Alara moved with frantic haste, placing pots and pans beneath the growing number of leaks, the chaotic drumming of water on metal a soundtrack to her panic. She lit a single lamp, its flame a fragile, golden thing in the oppressive dark, casting long, dancing shadows that twisted into monstrous shapes. She thought of James, of his laughter that used to fill this small space, now so utterly consumed by the roar of the wind. The town's verdict echoed in the storm's voice. Bad luck. The thought was a familiar poison. Sometime after midnight, a sound like the cracking of a giant's bone ripped through the din. The western wall of the cabin, the one bearing the full force of the gale, buckled inwards, splintering wood and letting in a cascade of mud and freezing water. A cry was torn from her throat, swallowed by the storm. This was it, the end of her small, stubborn stand. The cabin would go, and she would go with it. Through the new, gaping hole, she saw the world outside, a churning chaos of blackness and lightning. And in one of those brief, brilliant flashes, A figure was there, moving through the deluge toward her. The stranger. He was not a silhouette now but a solid, real presence. His slicker plastered to a broad frame, his face obscured by a low-brimmed hat. He did not hesitate at the threshold. He simply entered the breach, bringing the storm in with him. Alara scrambled back, her heart seizing, but he paid her no mind. His focus was absolute, fixed on the groaning, collapsing wall. Without a word, he braced his shoulder against the main support beam, his muscles straining against the immense pressure of the wind. He was a human buttress, a silent, immovable object against an unstoppable force. He gestured with a jerk of his head toward a pile of discarded lumber near the hearth. Understanding sliced through her fear. She moved, her limbs stiff and clumsy, and dragged the heavy planks toward him. He worked with a grim, silent efficiency, wedging the supports into place, his hands sure and strong. He used her own axe to hammer them secure, the rhythmic thuds a counterpoint to the storm's rage. He found a tattered piece of canvas sailcloth she had used to cover the woodpile and, with surprising agility, climbed onto the weakened roof, fighting the wind to nail it over the worst of the damage. The roar inside the cabin lessened, the cascade of water slowing to a persistent drip. He dropped back to the floor, soaked and breathing hard. He looked at her then, his eyes dark and unreadable in the lamplight. She saw a scar bisecting his left eyebrow. He gave a single, curt nod, then turned and walked back out into the storm without a sound, disappearing as quickly as he had arrived. Alara stood, trembling, in the center of her battered but standing home, the silence he left behind more profound than the storm itself. The next morning, on her porch, sat 2 rabbits, cleaned and ready for the pot. Trust was a foreign currency she could no longer afford. For 3 days, Alara watched the rabbits, then the man, a knot of suspicion tightening in her gut. Charity was rare. Strings were always attached. But the hunger was a more pressing reality. She cooked the meat, the first real meal she'd had in a week, and the simple act of eating felt like a betrayal of her own caution. She began to observe him more closely. His name, she learned from a passing supply wagon driver who shouted it over the wind, was Silas. He worked his land with a relentless, quiet rhythm, turning the unforgiving soil, reinforcing his small home. He asked for nothing, spoke to no one. He was an island, much like herself. An unspoken routine began between them. He would leave a brace of rabbits or a fish from the creek on her porch every few days. After her initial hesitation, she began to leave something in return. A small jar of the wild berry preserves she'd put up in better times, a mended tear in a work shirt she'd found on his fence line. There were no words, only the objects, a sparse dialogue of survival. One afternoon, a dust cloud on the road signaled a different kind of visitor. Mr. Croft, the landowner who controlled the town of Redemption and most of the territory around it, reined in his fine black horse before her cabin. He was a man whose presence soured the air, his smile thin and predatory. "Still here, Mrs. Hayes?" he said, not as a question. His eyes swept over the patched wall, the signs of her meager survival. Tenacious, but the land has its way. This place is cursed. He leaned forward on his saddle horn. "I'll give you $20 for the deed. Enough to get you to a city where a woman's luck, good or bad, might not matter so much." The offer was an insult, a tenth of its worth for the water rights alone. "It's not for sale," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Croft's smile vanished. "That stranger over there," he sneered, gesturing toward Silas's homestead. "He can't help you. No one can. You bring ruin, woman. Everyone knows it." He spurred his horse, leaving his cruelty to hang in the air. That evening, Alara looked toward Silas's sod house, where a light now burned. He was not a savior, but for the first time she wondered if he might be an ally. The cruelty of men was often quieter and more patient than that of nature. A week after Croft's visit, Alara noticed the creek was shrinking. The steady, life-giving trickle of water that bisected her property, nourishing the cottonwoods and her own small well, was dwindling to a muddy crawl. She followed it upstream, her heart sinking with every step. Just beyond her property line, a hastily constructed dam of rock and earth diverted the flow, redirecting the precious water toward Croft's vast cattle pastures. It was a slow, deliberate strangulation. Without the creek, her well would run dry in a month. She would be forced out just as he'd planned. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She could go to the sheriff in town, but the sheriff was a Croft man. She could appeal to the townsfolk, but they would see it as the land finally purging itself of her bad luck. There was only one person who had shown her anything other than contempt. Making the choice felt like stepping off a cliff. She walked the distance between their properties, the dry earth crunching under her worn boots. Silas was splitting wood, the axe rising and falling with powerful economy. He stopped when he saw her approach, resting the axe head on the chopping block. He waited. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind. "He's diverted the creek," she said, the words feeling small and inadequate. "Mr. Croft, my well will be dry soon." She did not ask for help, did not know how. She only stated the fact, a final, desperate confession. Silas looked past her, toward the dying line of trees along the creek bed. He studied her face, his gaze lingering on the desperation she could not hide. He simply nodded. That was all. The next day, he met her at the Mercantile in Redemption. Croft was holding court near the counter, his cronies laughing at some cruel joke. The store fell silent as Silas entered, with Alara a step behind him. Croft's eyes narrowed. "Well, look what the wind blew in," he drawled. "Come to your senses, widow?" He turned his sneer on Silas. "And you should know better than to get tangled up with her. She's bad luck. Everything she touches withers." Silas moved to stand directly before him. He was not as tall as Croft, but he possessed a density, a rootedness the other man lacked. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and calm, yet it cut through the silence like a razor. "I don't trust in luck," Silas declared, his eyes locked on Croft's. "Only choice. And you've made yours." He turned, looked at Alara and said, "We have work to do." He walked out, leaving Croft speechless and the townsfolk staring, the certainty of their superstition suddenly shaken. The work was brutal. It was a choice made of sweat and broken fingernails, of aching backs and calloused hands. Instead of fighting Croft over the diverted creek, Silas had a different plan. He chose a spot near the cabin, a place where the willows grew thickest, and began to dig. A new well, deeper. He was searching for the aquifer, the water that ran beneath the surface, untouchable by petty dams and the greed of men. He taught her how to use the shovel, not as a woman might, but as a partner must, leveraging her weight, finding a rhythm. They worked from sunrise to sunset, a silent team bound by a shared purpose. The hole deepened, foot by agonizing foot. The town watched. Some days, wagons would slow on the road, their occupants staring at the strange tableau. The blackbird widow and the silent stranger, toiling together in the dirt. They offered no help, but their whispers grew less certain. Alara felt the change in their gaze. It was no longer just pity or scorn. There was a flicker of something else, something akin to grudging respect. She was no longer just the woman things happened to. She was a woman who was doing. Her own grief, once an all-consuming fog, began to recede, burned away by the sun on her neck and the fire in her muscles. She was too tired for sorrow, too focused for despair. One afternoon, when the sun was at its zenith and the hole was deep enough to swallow a man whole, Silas's shovel struck something different. Not the dull thud of rock, but a wet, sucking sound. He drove the shovel in again, and when he pulled it out, the clay was dark, slick and heavy with moisture. Water began to seep from the bottom of the well, slow at first, then faster, pooling into a muddy, miraculous puddle. They had found it. Alara sank to her knees at the edge, peering into the darkness. She saw not just water, but a future. That evening, the fire in her hearth burned brighter. The cabin, once a place of fear and loss, felt solid around her. It was a fortress they had defended together. They sat at her small table, sharing a meal of stew and fresh bread she had baked from flour Silas had bought in town. The silence between them was no longer a void, but a comfortable, shared space. It was filled with the unspoken understanding of their shared labor, of the victory they had earned. Alara looked down at her hands. They were raw and stained with earth, the nails chipped, the palms tough. They were not the hands of the woman she used to be. They were stronger. They were her own. Silas watched her, his expression softened by the firelight. The scar over his eye seemed less severe, just a part of the landscape of his face. "Thank you," she said. The word simple but holding the weight of everything that had passed between them. He gave that same small nod, but this time it felt different. It was an acknowledgement of a partnership forged. The land outside was still harsh, the coming winter would be long, and the hearts of the people in redemption might never fully change. But the suffocating mantle of bad luck had been lifted, not by magic or fate, but by a choice. Her choice to endure and his choice to stand with her. The future was still a vast, unknown territory, but she would not face it alone. And that, she realized, felt a great deal like hope.